The Dark Lords of the Sith were, without a doubt, the greatest threats the galaxy ever faced. Their shadowy legacy stretched back thousands of years. Many fearsome Dark Lords rose and fell over the centuries, spreading death and despair across known space. But how did this legacy begin? Who was the first Dark Lord of the Sith? In this video, we'll be answering that question and taking a look at the birth of the first Sith Empire.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Followers of the dark side predated the Sith by tens of thousands of years, regularly clashing with their counterparts on the light side. During the early ages of the Republic, the Jedi Order usually quashed these dark side threats before they could attain significant power. Sometimes, however, these threats came from inside the Jedi Order itself, leading to schisms. The First Great Schism, a war between the Jedi Order and the Dark Jedi of the Legions of Leto, was an early example of this. The First Great Schism ended fairly quickly, with the Jedi emerging victorious, but it set a nasty precedent, inspiring many future Dark Jedi. In 7000 BBY, there was a Second Great Schism. Yet again, a sect of Jedi embraced the dark side and broke off from the Order. But these Dark Jedi were different from those who had come before. Unlike the Legions of Leto, they were committed to the dark side's utmost extremes, and they developed alchemical techniques that allowed them to infuse objects and beings with the dark side. In time, their alchemical practices developed into techniques for creating, shaping, and corrupting life, breeding abominations of nature they called Leviathans. When the Jedi Order learned of this, they agreed that these schismatics were a threat to life itself, and again, they went to war. Unlike the First Great Schism, the war with these new Dark Jedi was not won so easily. In fact, the Dark Jedi held out for a full century. This terrible war between light and dark, called the 100-Year Darkness, was hard fought by both sides, but in the end, the Jedi had the advantage. The war ended with the Battle of Korbos, in which all but a dozen of the Dark Jedi were slain. The Republic wanted the Jedi to execute the survivors, but the Jedi resolved to exile them instead. Hoping the Dark Jedi would find redemption on some deserted rimworld, the Jedi marched their defeated foes aboard a galleon and shot it into the unknown. It's possible that they never made a worse mistake. These exiles were among the greatest of the Dark Jedi. Among their number were Sauzas Sin, their most gifted alchemist, Karnus Mor, a vicious warlord, Baron Draper, the admiral of their last fleet, and Zozan, the Marchioness of the Black Legions. Their leader was High General Ajunta Pal, the greatest of the schismatic Dark Jedi, who had single-handedly slain a dozen Jedi in one encounter during the Battle of Korbos. Under Ajunta Pal's direction, Sauzas Sin steered the exiles' galleon toward a powerful force signature, the world that screamed the loudest to those who hear the dark side's call. They landed on Korriban. On Korriban, the exiles discovered a species of red-skinned force sensitives called the Sith, who had built a civilization on the use of the dark side. The natives were initially suspicious of the exiles, but Ajunta Pal eventually cowed them with a fearsome display of force power. The Sith, thinking that Pal was a manifestation of one of their gods, took the exiles to Ziost, their species' adopted homeworld. There, they met with Hakagram Grouch, then the foremost Sith king, and demanded he bow before them. Grouch resisted and attacked Ajunta Pal, but he was quickly defeated. Pal executed Grouch with his own sword and declared himself the Dark Lord of the Sith. This brutal display of strength allowed the exiles to subjugate the Sith purebloods and become the very first Sith Lords. Each of them laid claim to one of the scattering worlds the Sith had colonized, together forming the Sith Empire. Ajunta Pal, the Dark Lord, ruled over all from Ziost, and Sauzas Sin served as his shadow hand or deputy. The other 10 Sith Lords formed the Council. Each of them managed a part of the Empire, but they would meet regularly to rule the Empire as a whole. In the unknown space beyond the borders of the Republic, the Sith Lords expanded their new empire, forming armies, building strongholds, and breeding new monsters, which were now called Sith Spawn. They adopted many of the traditions of the Sith and abandoned many Jedi traditions they had continued to cling to. Most notably, they stopped using lightsabers, opting instead to wield alchemically enhanced swords, as most Sith purebloods did. The Sith, however, retained the knowledge of lightsaber technology, but use of the weapon rose and fell over the course of the Empire's history. In the years after their conquest of the Sith, Ajun Pal and his followers became acquainted with many of the Sith worlds. On Ziost, their adopted homeworld, they built the towering Sith Citadel, a massive fortress city from which they ruled their empire. They also established Sith holdings on Korriban, the original homeworld of the Sith purebloods, which the purebloods had used as a graveyard. They investigated the many tombs and caverns of Korriban, unearthing many of the planet's long-forgotten secrets. The Sith Lords discovered one particular valley on Korriban that was especially steeped in the dark side, and in the caverns below it, they found the greatest secret of all, a Rakatan star map. This ancient dark side artifact was the source of the shadow that lay over the valley, and they discovered that they could draw on it to enhance their power. The Sith Lords laid claim to the valley, which was later named the Valley of the Dark Lords, and built a great fortress there, which they intended to use as a redoubt in case the Jedi ever discovered them and attacked. Ajun Pal spent his reign as a Dark Lord consolidating his power and building up the Sith Empire. Some of the other Sith Lords, hungry for revenge on the Jedi, took a Sith fleet to attack the Republic prematurely, but the others were mostly content to hold back and build up their armies instead. They were more focused on increasing their individual powers and furthering the art of Sith alchemy, creating ever greater abominations in the breeding pits of Ziost. During his time in power, Ajun Pal, like many of the other Sith Lords, forged an alchemically enhanced sword for himself. This double-bladed weapon was forged of black steel and was always cold to the touch. Shadows rippled along the edge of the blade, giving it a particularly sinister appearance. Ajun Pal poured much of his power into this sword, and with it slew a great many enemies. So terrible was this sword that its legend lasted for thousands of years, with the Sith purebloods considering it a sacred artifact. A rhyme was often used to symbolize the weapon in Sith writings. I am that which grips the heart in fright, hearkens the night and silences the light. Ajun Pal ruled for decades, but as with all Dark Lords, his reign eventually came to an end. He was killed in battle, but not by a Jedi and not by any other foe of the Sith Empire. Pal's spectre later recounted how he and the rest of the Sith Lords met their ends.
What choice have I? I betrayed my old masters. They would never let me return to the light side. It is too late, too late. Here is where I rest. Here is where my eternity awaits. If I could return, oh my master, it has been so long, and I regret so much.
The first Sith Lords met the same fates as many of their successors. They envied each other, schemed against one another, and in the end, they destroyed each other. Battle broke out in the fortress on Korriban, which was destabilized by the fighting and collapsed. Ajun Pal and his contemporaries were all killed. The Sith Empire that Pal and his followers created endured long after their deaths. New Sith Lords arose from among the Sith purebloods, and a second Dark Lord was chosen. The fortress in the Valley of Dark Lords was never rebuilt. Instead, the Sith used the caverns of the valley to bury their fallen Dark Lords. Ajun Pal was laid to rest in the first of the valley's tombs, buried with his sword and those of his slain rivals. His successors remembered him as one of the most powerful Sith to ever live, and went on to terrorize the galaxy for thousands of years in his name. But the story of Ajun Pal doesn't end with his death. Pal's spirit remained trapped in the world of the living, tied to his sword. He lingered in the tomb on Korriban for thousands of years, alone and impotent. In time, a strange thing happened. He began to feel remorse for what he had done. Even as the Sith thrived and spread across the galaxy, their founder came to regret falling to the dark side in the first place. Pal's torment only ended when the redeemed Revan arrived 3,000 years after his death, seeking the Dark Lord's sword. The spectre of Ajun Pal appeared to Revan, requesting that he take the sword and leave. Revan did so, but before parting with the Dark Lord's spirit, he suggested the possibility of redemption. Pal, at first, didn't believe he could be redeemed, but at Revan's urging, he abandoned the dark side and surrendered himself to the will of the Force. Finally at peace, the spirit of Ajun Pal returned to the light and merged with the Force, freed from his torment at last. So that's our look at the moral philosophies of 3 more clone commanders. But what do you think? Are there other characters you'd like to see us analyze in this fashion? If so, which ones? Let us know that in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.